The first time Grace Hale walked through the doors of the dusty Crown Saloon carrying a tin plate of supper for Ezekiel Thatcher, every man in that room held his breath and waited for someone to die. It was the summer of 1879, deep in the sun-cracked heart of Laramie, Wyoming Territory, a town that had grown up hard and fast along the Union Pacific line and had never quite lost its edge. Laramie sat at the crossroads of cattle trails and commerce, a place where railroad men drank alongside cowboys, where the law tried its best and sometimes failed, and where a man's reputation was worth more than his weight in silver. The town had its rules, mostly unspoken, and the most important one was this: you did not bother Ezekiel Thatcher. You did not look at him too long. You did not sit at his table. You certainly did not bring him food like he was an ordinary man who needed tending to. And yet there she was, Grace Hale, all 24 years of her, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a cotton bonnet that had seen better days, her boots dusty from the walk across Main Street, carrying a tin plate of beans and salt pork and a thick heel of cornbread as if she were delivering supper to a schoolteacher. Ezekiel Thatcher was 31 years old and built like something the frontier itself had carved out of granite and bad weather. He was not the biggest man in Laramie, but he was the most dangerous, and everybody knew it. He had come to town 2 years prior with nothing but a horse, a bedroll, and a reputation that had traveled ahead of him like a cold wind. Stories had followed him out of Texas and across the territories. Stories about what he had done during the years after the war when lawlessness had spread across the plains like wildfire. Stories about the men who had pushed him and the men who had paid for it. His eyes were the color of old pewter, pale gray and unreadable, and he wore them beneath the brim of a battered black hat that shadowed his jaw. He had a scar along his left cheekbone, thin as a thread, and hands that were large and scarred at the knuckles from work and from worse. He ran cattle now, or so the official version went. He had a spread 10 miles east of town, a modest operation by most standards, but he ran it tightly and he ran it well, and the men who worked for him were quietly loyal in the way that men are loyal when they both respect and fear their employer. He came into Laramie every week or so, conducted his business, drank one whiskey at the Dusty Crown and left. Nobody asked him questions. Nobody started trouble near him. Sheriff Amos Garrett, a decent man with a thick mustache and a practical soul, had once confided to his deputy that he was grateful Thatcher had chosen the quiet life, because he genuinely was not certain what it would cost to rein the man in if he hadn't. Grace Hale had arrived in Laramie 6 months before that summer evening, coming in on the train from Missouri with a trunk of kitchen supplies, a box of seeds, and the deed to a small plot of land on the edge of town that her uncle had left her when he died. She had no husband, no family nearby, and no particular fear of hard work. She had opened a small eating establishment out of the ground floor of the building that stood on her land, a clean, plain room with 4 tables, and a chalkboard menu and food that was honest and filling and better than anything else available in Laramie by a considerable distance. She called it simply Hale's, because she saw no reason to dress it up. The people of Laramie had taken to her with the cautious warmth of a community that had learned not to trust too quickly, but had also learned the value of a good meal. The ranch hands liked her biscuits. The railroad men liked her coffee. The women of the town respected her self-sufficiency, even if they sometimes whispered about whether it was quite right for a young woman to be running a business alone. Grace paid those whispers no mind. She had come to Laramie to build something, and that was what she intended to do. She had first seen Ezekiel Thatcher from across the street when he rode in one Tuesday morning in April. She had been sweeping her front step when the sound of his horse drew her attention, and she had watched him tie up at the general store with the unhurried movements of a man who had long since stopped worrying about who was watching. Someone nearby, old Pete Calhoun, who sat outside the barber shop most mornings with his pipe, had leaned over and told her in a low voice that that was Thatcher, and he had said the name the way people say the name of something they would rather not look at directly. Grace had looked directly. She was not reckless or foolish. She was, in fact, an exceptionally practical woman. But she had been raised by a mother who taught her that fear, as a general rule, was most dangerous when it was allowed to go unexamined. And so Grace made it a habit to look at the things that frightened people and decide for herself what she thought. What she thought, watching Ezekiel Thatcher untie his saddlebag and tuck it under his arm and stride into the general store, was that he looked like a man carrying something very heavy that had nothing to do with the saddlebag. She had filed that observation away and gone back to sweeping. The evening she brought him supper had come about through a sequence of events that were so ordinary they were almost funny in retrospect. It was a Thursday, and the Dusty Crown's cook had quit that morning in a fury over a dispute with the owner, a pink-faced man named Douglas Reese who ran the saloon and had a talent for underpaying people. By early evening, the saloon had no food to offer, and Douglas Reese was standing in Grace's doorway looking desperate, asking if she could send over whatever she had for the handful of paying customers who were already settled in and expecting supper. Grace had agreed, because she had food to spare, and because Douglas Reese's desperation was not entirely unsympathetic. She had loaded up plates and sent them over with her one helper, a 16-year-old boy named Tommy Briggs who ran errands for her. Tommy had come back 10 minutes later, pale-faced, with the plates still in his hands. "He is sitting at the table I was supposed to go to," Tommy said, and he did not need to explain who he meant. Everyone in Laramie said he the same way when they meant Thatcher. Grace had looked at the plates, looked at Tommy, and made a decision that was less dramatic in her own mind than it would later seem to everyone else. She took the plates from Tommy, stacked them efficiently, and walked them across the street herself. The saloon had gone quiet when she pushed through the doors with her elbow, her hands full. She was aware of the quiet. She was aware of the eyes. She walked between the tables with the same brisk, matter-of-fact pace she used when she cleared dishes at Hale's, and she set the first plates down at the table nearest the door, and she kept moving, and then she was standing at Ezekiel Thatcher's table. He was sitting with his back to the wall, the way men like him always did, with one forearm on the table and a glass of whiskey in front of him, and those pale gray eyes looking up at her with an expression that was not quite surprise but was the closest thing to it she suspected he allowed himself in public. She set the plate down in front of him. Beans, salt pork, cornbread. She straightened up. "Careful with the edge of that plate," she said. "It runs hot." He looked at her, he looked at the plate, he looked at her again. "You're the woman from Hale's," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, quiet in the way of a man who had learned that quiet voices carry further than loud ones when they need to. "That's right," she said. "Douglas Reese asked me to help out. His cook left this morning." Thatcher picked up his fork with 2 fingers. He turned it once, looking at it as if it were a foreign object. Then he looked back up at her. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It was not a question exactly. It was closer to a statement of fact that he was still in the process of verifying. "I'm afraid of plenty of things," Grace said honestly, "but I don't see why supper should be one of them. Eat before it cools." And then she turned around and delivered the rest of the plates. She felt his eyes on her back the whole time she was moving around the room. She felt them follow her to the door. She did not turn around to confirm it because she had made her point and she was a woman who knew when enough was enough. The next morning, a $10 coin appeared on her front step, weighted down by a smooth river stone. There was no note. There did not need to be. Tommy looked at it and then looked at Grace with an expression of absolute bewilderment. "That's Thatcher's doing, isn't it?" he said. "Put it in the cash box," Grace said, and went inside to start the morning's bread. The river stone she kept on the windowsill above her work table, though she could not have explained entirely why. The following Thursday, Ezekiel Thatcher came to Hale's for supper. He came in just before the dinner hour, when the place was not yet full, and he stood in the doorway for a moment as if giving the room time to adjust to him being in it, which it needed. The two ranch hands at the far table went very still. The older woman dining alone near the window became interested in the pattern of the tablecloth. Grace came out of the kitchen with a dish towel over her shoulder and looked at him. "Sit anywhere," she said. He chose the table nearest the window, with his back to the wall and a sight line to the door, and he sat with his hat on the table beside him. And Grace noticed, for the first time, that his dark hair had a slight wave to it that the hat usually concealed. She brought him coffee without being asked, because everyone who sat down at Hale's got coffee, and she told him what was on the board that evening, which was venison stew and a roasted potato, and whatever pie he wanted for a nickel extra. "Stew," he said. "Good choice," she said, and went to get it. She served him the same way she served everyone, without ceremony or excess attention, and he ate the way he did most things, which was quietly and with a kind of deliberate focus. When he finished, he pushed the plate a few inches forward in the way that meant done, and she came and cleared it, and he paid with exact change. "Stew was good," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Come back Friday if you want the pot roast. It's better." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, like a crease in old leather. "I might do that," he said. He picked up his hat from the table and stood, and he was taller than she had registered when he was seated, tall enough that she had to tip her chin up slightly to maintain eye contact, which she did without hesitation. He came back on Friday for the pot roast, and then the following Thursday for the stew, and then twice the week after, on Tuesday for lunch and Friday for supper. Nobody in Laramie quite knew what to make of it. The whispers started out nervous and gradually became something closer to fascinated. The widow Clara Morris, who was Grace's nearest neighbor and had appointed herself something of an informal advisor to the younger woman, sat down at Hale's one afternoon and folded her hands on the table and said, "Grace, people are talking." "People always are," Grace said, refilling Clara's coffee cup. "Thatcher," Clara said, in the same meaningful tone that Pete Calhoun had used the first time he said the name. "He's a customer," Grace said. "He pays on time and he doesn't cause trouble. Those are my only criteria." Clara gave her a long look. "He's dangerous, Grace. He killed 3 men in Texas." "Could be more." "That was Texas," Grace said, "and I don't know the particulars, neither do you." Clara wrapped both hands around her cup and dropped her voice. "I worry about you. You're a young woman alone out here." Grace sat down across from her because this deserved a real response. "Clara, I came out here alone on a train with a trunk and a deed and a box of tomato seeds. I have built a business from nothing in 6 months. If I let myself be frightened of every man with a hard past in this town, I'd never serve a single customer, because nearly all of them have one. Thatcher comes in, he eats, he pays, he leaves. He has never been anything other than decent to me." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You like him," she said. Grace opened her mouth to deny it and then found that she could not quite complete the denial with the honesty she preferred. She closed her mouth, stood up, and went back to the kitchen. The truth was something she had been examining with her usual careful practicality for several weeks by then, turning it over the way she had turned over the river stone, looking at it from different angles. The truth was that Ezekiel Thatcher was not what she had expected. She had expected cold. She had expected the flat, switched-off quality she had seen in certain men whose capacity for softness had been entirely burned away. Instead, what she found in those quiet mealtimes was a man who was intensely private but not unkind, whose silences were thoughtful rather than hostile, who had once, when little Sarah Pittman from the schoolhouse had come in for a piece of pie with her mother and knocked over her glass of milk crying about it, said to the child in that low, quiet voice of his, "No harm done, little one," in a way that had made Sarah stop crying immediately and had made Grace feel something shift warmly in her chest. He never overstayed, he never pushed. He had never once looked at her with anything other than a kind of grave, steady attention that was different from the way other men sometimes looked at her, which was with the slightly proprietary casualness of men who thought a woman alone was a woman available. Thatcher's attention was more like respect, and Grace had enough experience to know that in Laramie in 1879, that was not a small thing. In late July, a different sort of situation presented itself. Grace had been closing up for the evening, washing the last dishes in the dim light of her kitchen lamp, when she heard a commotion out on the street. She dried her hands and went to the door and opened it a crack. There were 3 men on horseback outside the saloon across the street, and they were being loud in the way that drunk men are loud when they are also looking for a reason. She recognized 2 of them as brothers named Clyde and Roy Prentice, who came through Laramie with a cattle drive roughly twice a year, and who were, in her experience, the sort of men who were unpleasant to women when they thought they could be without consequence. The third man she didn't know. What happened in the next few minutes was this. The 3 men climbed down from their horses and pushed into the saloon, and about 2 minutes after that, there was a crash and raised voices, and then the doors swung open again, and Clyde Prentice came stumbling out backward, landing hard in the dust of the street. And a moment later Roy Prentice was standing in the doorway looking uncertain. And then Ezekiel Thatcher walked out through the swinging doors and stood on the step and looked at Clyde Prentice in the dust with that expression he had. The one that was colder than the high Wyoming nights. "Get up," Thatcher said. "Get on your horse, take your brother, don't come back tonight." Clyde Prentice got up. He was a big man, but he got up carefully, with the kind of care that comes from recognizing something bigger than yourself. He did not say anything. He got on his horse. Roy Prentice was already on his. The third man had apparently decided to take a side exit. The 3 of them disappeared down the street. Thatcher stood there a moment in the dust, and then he turned his head and looked directly at Grace's cracked door as if he had known she was there the whole time. She opened it wider because there was no point in pretending. "Everyone all right?" she asked. "Fine," he said. "What was that about?" He was quiet a moment. "They were making themselves unpleasant to a woman inside," he said. His voice was entirely flat and factual. Grace looked at him. In the lamplight from the saloon he looked like something out of one of those dime novels, all sharp angles and shadow and the kind of stillness that came from absolute self-possession. "Thank you," she said, "for handling it." "Nobody handled anything," he said. "They just made a better decision." She almost smiled. "Good night, Ezekiel," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she used it deliberately, and she watched him register it. He paused, just briefly. "Good night, Grace," he said. She closed her door and stood in her kitchen with her hands flat on the work table, looking at the river stone on the windowsill, and she let herself fully acknowledge, for the first time and without argument, that she was falling in love with the most feared man in Laramie, Wyoming territory. The acknowledgement, once made, settled something in her rather than unsettling it. That was the thing about Grace Hale that most people eventually came to understand. She did not fight her own truths once she had finished examining them. She accepted them and worked with them. She had accepted the truth of this place, this hard, bright land, the endless sky, the winters that would be brutal and the work that would be constant and the loneliness that was sometimes sharp as a nail. She had accepted all of it and made her peace and kept going. She could accept this too. What she could not know, and would not know for some time, was that Ezekiel Thatcher was engaged in a parallel process of his own, conducted entirely in the privacy of his own chest and the long cold nights at his ranch east of town. He had not expected Grace Hale. He had not expected anything like her, had in fact long ago stopped expecting anything except more of the same, more hardness, more distance, more of the careful negotiated peace he had made with the world after years in which he and the world had been at war with each other. He had come to Laramie to be left alone, and mostly he had been, and mostly that had been enough. Then she had walked into the dusty crown without flinching and set his supper down and told him to watch for the hot edge of the plate, and something in him had moved that had not moved in a very long time. He was not a sentimental man. He was not accustomed to sentiment, had not been raised to it, had had most of it burned out of him by years that he did not care to examine too closely. He had grown up poor in East Texas in the aftermath of the war, had learned early that the world was indifferent to hardship, had found the cattle trails at 17 and learned his trade and learned, along the way, the harder lessons of survival in a territory where the law was thin and men were sometimes required to enforce their own. He had done things he was not proud of. He had made choices that were necessary and choices that were less so, and he had carried them all with him, and they weighed on him in the way that such things do on a man with a conscience, which he had, despite the rumors to the contrary. Grace Hale looked at him as though she saw the weight but was not concerned by it, as though it were simply a fact about him, like his height or his gray eyes, something that was part of what he was and therefore not alarming. Nobody had looked at him like that in a very long time. Possibly ever. He started coming to Hale's because the food was genuinely excellent, which was the truth, and because it was a clean, quiet place where no one bothered him, which was also true. He kept coming because of the way she moved around her own kitchen, brisk and sure and utterly without pretense, and because of the coffee which was always exactly right, and because of the small river stones she had begun lining up along her windowsill, 3 of them now, and because she said his name, Ezekiel, his full name that nobody else used, in a way that made it sound like something real rather than something to be wary of. August came in hot and dry. The cattle on his spread were doing well. His 2 ranch hands, brothers named Davis and Cal Mercer, were steady workers, and the weekly trips to Laramie had become the fixed point around which the rest of his week arranged itself in ways he recognized as significant and was not sure what to do about. One Thursday afternoon in mid-August, Thatcher came into Hale's to find Grace standing on a chair reaching up to a shelf that was inexplicably loose, holding a stack of plates against her chest with one arm while she tried to secure the bracket with her free hand. The chair was wobbling. He walked in, crossed the room, and put his hand flat against the shelf to steady it, and they were suddenly standing very close together, her on the chair and him standing beside it, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. The plates were between them. "I've been meaning to fix that shelf," she said. "I can see that," he said. "Give me those." She handed him the plates. He set them on the nearest table and then looked at the shelf bracket and looked around the room for tools, found none, and said, "You have a hammer." "In the back room," she said. "On the nail by the door." He went and found it and came back and fixed the bracket in under 2 minutes, working with the efficient economy of a man who was comfortable with his hands. Grace stepped down from the chair and watched him. "Thank you," she said. "That shelf would have come down on you," he said. "I know. I've been putting it off." He stood back and tested the bracket with the flat of his palm. It held. He turned around and found her watching him with that expression she had, the direct one that he had come to think of as distinctly hers, the one that saw things clearly and did not pretend otherwise. "You could have asked someone," he said. "I don't like asking," she said. "I know," he said. They looked at each other in the warm light of the August afternoon, and something passed between them that had been passing between them for weeks, getting denser and more substantial each time, the kind of thing that cannot be indefinitely deferred. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make you something." He sat down. She went into the kitchen. She came back with 2 cups of coffee and a plate of biscuits with honey, and she sat down across from him, which she did not normally do with customers, and they talked. This was perhaps the most remarkable thing that had happened so far. They talked. Not about anything large or weighty. It started with the shelf and moved to the difficulty of finding good timber in Laramie, and then to his cattle and the summer grass conditions, and then to the winter she should prepare for, which would be her first Wyoming winter, and she asked him questions about it with genuine interest, and he found himself telling her, specifically and usefully, about the things she would need to do to get the building through the cold months. The insulation and the firewood stores, and the way the wind came off the mountains from the northwest and could be brutal. He noticed as he talked that she listened with her whole self, leaning slightly forward over the table, her dark eyes fixed on him, her coffee cup held in both hands. He noticed that the talking came easier than he expected. He noticed that he did not feel the usual low-level alertness that he carried like a second skin in most social situations, the readiness, the watch. He felt, sitting across from Grace Hale over coffee and honey biscuits in the warm light of a Laramie afternoon, something he eventually identified as relaxed. It startled him enough that he went quiet for a moment, and she noticed. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Fine," he said. Then, because she deserved honesty and he knew it, "I'm not accustomed to this." "To what?" He looked at his coffee cup, then at her. "Talking," he said, "to someone." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said carefully, "You can. If you want, I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her for a long time. Outside, the main street sounds of Laramie drifted through the window, horse traffic, and the distant whistle of a train and the ordinary commerce of a summer afternoon. And in the middle of it, all this small, clean room and this woman and something he had almost given up on feeling. "I know," he said. He came back the next day, and the day after that. By September, the town had decided, with the collective instinct of communities that have always run on gossip and interpretation, that something was happening between the woman from Hales and the man they were still all quietly afraid of, and the opinions on this were varied and vigorous. Clara Morris had come around to a cautious approval, partly because she was an astute observer of character, and she could see the change in both of them. The way Grace seemed more settled, and the way Thatcher, when he walked through town now, seemed to carry less of whatever it was that made people step sideways when he passed. Sheriff Amos Garrett, who was a practical man, had a private conversation with his deputy that went, "If it keeps him eating at a restaurant and not shooting people, I'm entirely in favor of it." His deputy agreed. Pete Calhoun at the barbershop said to anyone who would listen that he had always known Thatcher had a decent streak in him, and nobody pointed out that he had said nothing of the sort previously. On a Friday evening in the second week of September, Thatcher arrived at Hales to find a note on the door in Grace's handwriting. It said, "Closed for supper. Come around back." He stood there reading it, and then he came around back. And there she was at the outdoor table she sometimes used in good weather, a plain wooden table under the cottonwood that grew behind the building, with 2 plates laid out and a lantern already lit against the early settling dusk, and the small bottle of wine she had been saving from a case a railroad merchant had given her in payment for a week of lunches. "I thought we could eat outside," she said. "It's the last of the warm evenings, probably." He took off his hat and looked at the table and looked at her, and he sat down, and she sat down across from him, and they ate supper together in the cooling September air under the cottonwood tree with the lantern between them, and it was the most private and deliberate thing either of them had done in years. She had cooked the roasted chicken that she usually only made on Sundays, with the herbs she had grown in the small kitchen garden behind the building, and there were potatoes done in the drippings, and the wine was sweet and a little rough, and it was the best meal he had eaten since before a time he could clearly remember. They talked, and the talking had reached a different depth now, the kind that happens in the particular intimacy of shared food and firelight and the safety of being known. She told him about Missouri, about the mother who had taught her to cook and to think, who had died 3 years prior, and whose absence still showed up in unexpected places. She told him about the decision to come west, which had been made in grief, and also in the understanding that the life available to her in Missouri was not large enough for her. He listened to all of it with the complete attention he gave to everything she said. Then he told her something he had not told anyone in Laramie, which was that he had a younger sister in Texas, in San Antonio, whom he wrote to every month and whom he had not seen in 3 years. Her name was Annie, and she was 26, and she had married a good man and had 2 children, and the letters from her were the one consistent softness in his life that he had allowed himself to keep. He told this to Grace simply, looking at the lantern flame, and she heard what was underneath it, which was the loneliness of a man who had exiled himself from the people who knew him as something other than what the world at large had made of him. "You could go see her," Grace said. "I know," he said. "What stops you?" He was quiet. "I don't want her to see what I've become." Grace looked at him across the lantern. "What have you become?" she asked. He met her eyes. "You know what people say." "I know what people say," she said. "I also know you fixed my shelf and you ran off the Prentice brothers before they could frighten someone, and you leave $10 coins on people's doorsteps when you think they've done you a kindness. I know you say no harm done to crying children." "I think," she said, with the careful precision of a woman who has thought about something for a long time, "that what you've become is someone who is carrying a great deal alone because he doesn't believe he has the right to put it down." The silence that followed that was the longest they had ever sat in together. The cottonwood moved overhead. The lantern flame steadied. Somewhere down the street a fiddle started up in the saloon. "Grace," he said. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I just wanted you to know that I see it." He looked at her, and the thing in his chest that had been moving all summer moved decisively and fully. And it was not a small thing, and it was not a careful thing. It was large and warm, and it terrified him slightly, and he was grateful for it. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His hand was large and rough and warm, and she turned hers over beneath it, and they sat like that in the September dark until the lantern burned low, and neither of them needed anything else said that night. October came riding in on the back of a cold wind out of the northwest, exactly as he had told her it would, and Grace worked her way steadily through the list of winterizing measures he had described, and he helped her with several of them, showing up on a Saturday morning in early October with lumber and nails and a second-person strength, and they spent the day reinforcing her building against the coming cold. It was easy and companionable work, and they moved around each other in the space with the natural coordination of people who have learned each other's rhythms. Tommy Briggs, who had become devoted to Grace and regarded Thatcher with a complicated mixture of terror and hero worship, watched them from the corner of the yard, where he was stacking firewood, and thought, with the clarity of 16 years, that he had never seen the boss man look like anything other than a thundercloud before, and today he looked like someone had opened a window in him. It was also in October that Grace received a letter that complicated things. It came from a man named Gerald Forsyth, who was a land developer out of Cheyenne, and who wrote to inform her that he had become aware of certain irregularities in the original deed filing for her property, and that he believed, based on his legal consultation, that the land title was not entirely clear, and that he would be interested in resolving the matter through a purchase at a price he named, which was considerably below what the land was worth. Grace read the letter twice, set it on her table, and went and made tea, which was what she did when she needed to think carefully. She did not panic. She did not storm. She thought. The next morning she showed the letter to Ezekiel. He read it standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hand, and his expression went through several things in quick succession, none of which were pleasant to observe. When he finished reading, he set the letter on the table and looked at her. "This is a pressure tactic," he said. "Forsyth is known in this territory. He targets properties with women owners or absentee owners and manufactures disputes about titles. It usually works because most people don't know how to fight it and can't afford a lawyer." "Can I fight it?" Grace asked. "Yes," he said, "but you need to establish your title clearly. When your uncle filed the deed, who handled the transaction?" Grace went to her trunk and found the original paperwork, the deed and the accompanying filing receipts, and they went through it together at her kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window, and what they found was that the filing was solid. Her uncle had done it correctly, filed it properly with the Territorial Land Office, paid the fees. The title was clean. "So he's bluffing," Grace said. "He's hoping you'll be frightened enough not to look," Thatcher said. I was never going to be frightened enough not to look, she said. He looked at her with something in his face that was close to a smile and also close to something more serious. I know that, he said. Will he push harder when I don't respond to this letter? Thatcher was honest with her. Possibly. Men like Forsyth have friends in minor official positions. He might try to complicate things through the land office clerk or push a competing claim. But your paperwork is clean, and I know Sheriff Garrett. If Forsyth sends anyone here to pressure you, that becomes a legal matter, and Amos will take it seriously. Will you talk to Amos? Already planning to, he said. This afternoon. She looked at him across the table. Ezekiel. Yes. Thank you for not telling me not to worry about it. He understood what she meant. He had not minimized it or taken it over from her without her input or treated her as though the decision were not hers. He had laid out the facts and left the conclusions to her. It's your property, he said. Your fight. I'm just helping you see the terrain. That's exactly what I need, she said. He went to see Sheriff Garrett that afternoon, and Amos Garrett wrote a pointed letter to the Cheyenne Land Office on official stationery noting that any irregularity claims regarding the Hale property in Laramie would be examined closely, and that any party seeking to manufacture such claims should be aware they were in clear legal territory. Gerald Forsyth sent no further letters. The autumn settled over Laramie with all the beauty and severity it had in it, the sky going that impossibly deep blue that you only find at altitude, the cottonwoods turning to gold along the creek beds, the air sharpening each morning until Grace could see her own breath when she stepped outside to open her shutters. She loved it with a fierceness that surprised her, this hard land, this enormous sky, this place that demanded everything and gave back exactly what you put in, and sometimes a little more. Business had been strong through the summer and fall, and she had saved enough to think seriously about expanding, perhaps adding a second room for private dining, perhaps keeping the establishment open for breakfast, which she had been doing informally and finding popular. She worked through these plans in the evenings at her kitchen table and shared them with Ezekiel when he visited, and he listened to her plans with genuine attention and occasional practical observations about materials and costs, and she had come to understand that this was how he expressed care, through utility and precision, and the careful, honest engagement with whatever mattered to her. She had come to know other things about him in these autumn evenings. She knew that he read, which surprised some people but not her. He had a small collection of books at the ranch, mostly history and natural philosophy, and he had a curious mind that had been largely self-educated and was the more disciplined for it. She knew that he had a dry humor that surfaced rarely but was genuinely funny when it did. She knew that he regretted things, specific things, that he would not detail, but that she understood were connected to the years before he had come to Laramie and chosen the quiet life. She knew that the quiet life had been, in some sense, a penance, a deliberate reduction, and that he had not fully believed it could expand into something else until she had walked into the dusty crown with a tin plate of supper and not flinched. She knew all of this, and she held it carefully, the way you hold something you have been given that is both precious and fragile. On the last Sunday of October, she rode out to his ranch. She had borrowed a horse from the livery, a calm bay mare, and she rode the 10 miles east in the crisp morning air, arriving at the Thatcher spread just before noon. The ranch was a modest collection of buildings, a house, a barn, a bunkhouse, arranged sensibly against the prevailing wind behind a natural rise in the land. The house was plain and functional, with a covered porch and shuttered windows and a woodpile stacked high on one side. Davis and Cal Mercer were working in the near corral with a pair of young horses, and they stopped to watch her ride in with visible astonishment. Thatcher came out of the barn with a halter in his hand and stopped. "Grace," he said. "Good morning," she said, climbing down from the mare with the slight stiffness of someone who does not ride frequently. "I've never seen the ranch. I thought I'd come see it." He looked at her for a moment with the quiet intensity that had stopped being alarming and become, over these months, one of her favorite things about him. Then he said, Come in out of the cold. I'll make coffee." The inside of the house was as plain and functional as the outside, clean and ordered in the way of a man who lives alone and has made peace with that, with the small collection of books on a shelf by the fireplace and a good lamp on the table, and a single personal item that caught her eye immediately, which was a framed photograph on the mantelpiece of a young woman laughing at the camera with two small children pressed against her. "Annie," Grace guessed. "And her children," he said. "Thomas is 4. The baby's name is Clara." She looked at the photograph for a moment at the laughing young woman who had his coloring dark hair and the same strong jaw and the two small faces pressed against her. "She looks like you," she said. "People tell her that. She doesn't take it as a compliment." Grace laughed, a real laugh, and he looked at her laughing the way a man looks at something that illuminates a room, simply and without pretense. He made coffee and they sat by the fire he had built in the stone hearth, and she looked around at the plain walls and the functional furniture and the books and the single photograph, and she thought about all the ways a person's home tells the truth about them, and what the truth here told her was this. He was a man who had reduced his life to its essentials because he had not trusted himself with more, and the single photograph on the mantelpiece was the one extravagance that told her what he was capable of when he let himself keep something. "I want to ask you something," she said. He waited. "Do you want more than this?" She gestured, meaning the ranch, the solitude, all of it. He was quiet for long enough that she started to think he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "I didn't for a long time. I thought this was the appropriate amount." He looked at his coffee cup. "I think I was wrong about that." She set her cup down. "Ezekiel." "Yes, look at me." He looked at her, those pale gray eyes steady and unguarded in a way she had worked for and earned over these months, the way you earn trust from something that has been hurt and learned caution from it. "I'm in love with you," she said. Plainly and completely, the way she did everything. "I thought you should know, because I think you are the sort of man who needs to hear a thing stated clearly before he'll believe it." The silence in the room was absolute. Outside, the wind moved around the corners of the house, and the fire shifted in the hearth, and the horses were quiet in the barn. Then he stood up from his chair and came and knelt in front of hers, his large hands taking hers from her lap with a gentleness that she had suspected was in him all along, and he looked at her from a foot away with everything he was in his face, unguarded for the first time entirely. "Grace," he said, "I have been in love with you since you told me to watch for the hot edge of a plate." She laughed again, softly this time, and she put her hand against his jaw, the one with the thin scar along the cheekbone, and he leaned into it like he was leaning into something he had been standing outside of for a very long time. "Then we understand each other," she said. "We do," he said. He kissed her there by his fire in the morning cold, with the Wyoming autumn pressing against the windows and the photograph of Annie and her children watching from the mantelpiece. And it was the most natural thing in the world, and also, for both of them, the most significant. She stayed for midday dinner, which he cooked himself with the competent, no-nonsense approach of a man who had fed himself for years. A simple meal of beans and smoked beef and biscuits that he made from a recipe so basic it was almost funny. And she made suggestions about the biscuits which he accepted without defensiveness, and they ate at his plain table by the window and watched the autumn light move across the Wyoming hills. And it was, in its simplicity, one of the finest meals either of them had ever had. Davis and Cal Mercer, eating their own dinner in the bunkhouse, were aware that something had shifted in the quality of the sounds coming from the house, specifically the presence of a woman's laughter, and they exchanged a look and nodded quietly at each other. Davis, who was the older of the two, said nothing, but thought that it was past time and that Thatcher deserved it, which was not a thought he had expected to have about his employer when he first came to work at the spread, but which had grown in him over a year of observation. November arrived and the first snow came with it, the light exploratory snowfall of early winter that dusts the rooftops and the street in white and melts by midday. And Grace loved it with the wholehearted enthusiasm of someone experiencing it newly, standing on her front step in her coat, and watching the flakes with an expression of such uncomplicated delight that old Pete Calhoun, watching from across the street, smiled under his mustache and went back to his pipe. Thatcher rode in that first snow morning to help her with the last of the winter preparations, the extra insulation for the pipes and the banking of earth around the foundation, and found her on the front step watching the snow fall and made the tactical error of standing beside her and looking up at the sky with her because it was unexpectedly moving. The lightness of it, the silence, the way her face looked in the gray winter light, open and present and full of life. He took her hand in his gloved one, and she leaned against his arm, and they stood there in the snow together for a few minutes like the most ordinary couple in the world. Clara Morris looked out her window and saw them and put her hand over her heart and went to put the kettle on because she needed a moment. The winter deepened in December, and the temperature dropped hard, and the snow came seriously now. The real Wyoming winter snow that piled against the doors and turned the world white and still, and imposed its own slow rhythm on everything. Grace's business continued through it, the townspeople needing the warmth of a public hearth and a hot meal more than ever, and Hales became in the deep winter months a kind of gathering point for the community, the place where people came to be warm and to be around other people, and to eat food that tasted like someone had cared about making it. Thatcher came to town more frequently now, staying sometimes through the worst weather rather than riding 10 miles back in conditions that were genuinely hazardous. Sheriff Garrett, with the practical generosity of a man who understood what was what, did not remark on the fact that Thatcher's horse was sometimes tied at the livery for 2 nights running while the storm blew. On Christmas Eve of 1879, Grace cooked a proper Christmas supper at Hales for anyone in town who needed it, a generous spread of roasted goose and root vegetables and rolls and 3 different pies, and she invited Ezekiel, and she invited Clara Morris, and she invited Tommy Briggs and his mother, who was a quiet, tired woman who worked sewing alterations, and who cried a little when she saw the table laid out, which she apologized for. And Grace told her firmly not to apologize for a second. Sheriff Garrett came with his wife, a comfortable woman named Margaret who had decided within 5 minutes of meeting Grace that she approved of her completely and intended to say so to anyone who asked. The Mercer brothers rode in from the ranch and sat at the end of the table looking scrubbed and slightly awed by the indoor warmth and abundance. A few other townspeople came and went, and the room was warm and full of voices and the smell of good food. Thatcher sat beside Grace for the meal, and he was, by the standards of his public behavior, almost sociable, which for him meant he spoke when spoken to with something that was almost warmth rather than the flat courtesy he usually deployed in public settings. At one point during the meal, Margaret Garrett leaned over and said to her husband in a low voice, "Amos, that man looks happy." Amos Garrett, who had been watching Thatcher for 2 years with the careful attention of a man responsible for public order, looked down the table and agreed that this was accurate and felt, privately, something like relief. After the supper, when the tables had been cleared and most of the guests had gone home through the cold night, Grace and Thatcher washed the dishes together in the kitchen by lamplight, and she told him about the Christmases of her Missouri childhood, the particular smell of her mother's kitchen on Christmas morning, the way the windows would frost, the hymns they would sing, and he listened to all of it and told her, in return and unprompted, which was still somewhat new behavior for him, about an Annie when she was small, about how their mother had tried to make Christmas mean something despite everything, and Grace listened and understood what was underneath it, which was love, clear and simple and persistent, the love of a person who had kept something gentle in themselves through circumstances that had not been gentle at all. "Write to Annie," she said. "Tell her about me." He was quiet for a moment, stacking the clean plates. "What should I tell her?" "Tell her you're happy," Grace said. "She'll want to know that." He looked at her in the lamplight. "I am," he said. January and February of 1880 were the hardest months of the winter. Brutal cold and heavy snowfall, and the particular isolation of deep winter in Wyoming territory, where the world contracts down to the space between one warm building and the next. Grace managed her establishment and her supplies with the efficiency she brought to everything, and Ezekiel spent more time in town than out, and what had been a courtship conducted in public meals and afternoon conversations became something more fully integrated, the natural partnership of two people who have decided on each other and are getting on with living in each other's orbit. He helped her with the heavy work, the cold deliveries and the frozen pipes when they happened, and the structural maintenance that required two sets of hands. She fed him and talked with him, and one quiet January evening when he sat by her fire reading, and she sat across from him working on her accounts, looked up from her ledger and thought with a clarity that was almost stunning that this was exactly what she had wanted when she had packed her trunk and gotten on the train, not the specific form of it, which she could not have predicted, but the substance, the warmth and the realness, and the sense of being in a life that was genuinely hers. Built by her hands, including the parts of it that she had chosen, and that had, in some ways, chosen her. In March, a letter arrived from Annie Thatcher, now Annie Calloway, addressed to Grace Hale, Hale's eating establishment, Laramie, Wyoming territory. It was 2 pages long, written in a round, energetic hand, and it said, among other things, Ezekiel has told me about you in terms that are quite unlike any terms he has ever used about anything, and I want you to know that he is the stubbornest and most private man in the state of Texas, possibly the nation, and if he has let you see him, then you must be extraordinary. Please take care of him. He would never say he needs it, but he does. Grace read the letter 3 times and then wrote back immediately, and the beginning of a correspondence that would last for years was established. She showed Ezekiel the letter she had received and watched his face do the complicated thing it did when Annie was the subject. That mixture of love and long absence, and the self-imposed distance he was slowly beginning to understand, had cost him more than it had protected anyone. She wants to come visit, he said, which was not quite in the letter but was implied strongly enough. She should, Grace said. It's a long trip from San Antonio. She has 2 children, not a disability, Grace said, with the fond briskness that he had come to love about her, the way she cut through the excuses to the real thing beneath them. He looked at her with that look he had, the one that was entirely for her, the one that nobody who had only seen Ezekiel Thatcher publicly would have believed he was capable of. You are something, Grace Hale, he said. I am practical, she said. Write to your sister and tell her to come in the summer. He wrote the letter that evening at her kitchen table. Spring came slowly and beautifully, the snow retreating up the hillsides and the cottonwood buds breaking open, and the smell of mud and new grass riding in on the warming wind. Grace put in her kitchen garden in late April, the tomatoes and the beans and the herbs, and she expanded the eating establishment as she had planned, knocking out the wall of the back room to create a larger dining space that could seat 12 instead of 8, and hired a young woman named Nell Duffy to help serve, who was sensible and quick and took to the work immediately. The expansion coincided with a period of increased prosperity for Laramie generally, a small land rush in the surrounding territory bringing new families and new commerce, and Hales went from comfortable to genuinely successful with satisfying speed. Thatcher watched all of this with proprietary pride that he did not fully bother to conceal, which was noted by everyone, and which Clara Morris described to Margaret Garrett as heartwarming, to which Margaret Garrett agreed. On a May evening with the world greening up around them and the light lasting long into the evening, they were sitting on Grace's back step after she had closed for the night, the way they often did now in warm weather, and he said without preamble, because he was not a man who built up to things with speeches, I want to marry you. She turned to look at him. I want you to be my wife, he said, meeting her eyes steadily. I know that's a change for you. I know you've built what you have here on your own terms, and I don't want to take any of that from you. I want to be beside you, if you'll have me. She looked at him for a long moment in the May evening, the man that everyone feared, sitting on her back step with his hat in his hands and his gray eyes completely open to her, offering her everything he was. "Yes," she said. He exhaled once slowly, and then he reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring, a simple gold band with a small set turquoise stone that he had ordered from a jeweler in Cheyenne with careful specifications. And he put it on her finger and it fit, because he had been paying the particular kind of close attention to the small details of her for 10 months, and he had noted the size of her hands. She looked down at the ring and then back up at him, and she was crying, which surprised her and not him, because he had come to understand the texture of her courage, how much she held steady, and he had thought she might need to let something go for a moment. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat on the back step in the May evening with the cottonwood moving overhead and the kitchen garden coming up in its rows and the ring on her hand, and neither of them said anything for a while because nothing needed to be said. They married in June, on a Saturday morning with the sky, a perfect flat blue overhead, and the streets of Laramie bearing the particular festive energy of a community that had fully invested in an event. Grace wore a dress she had made from blue cotton, the color of the sky, because she was not a white dress kind of woman and she knew it, and her dark hair was down for the first time in public. And when she walked out to where Ezekiel was waiting by the small church at the south end of town, she heard the murmur that went through the assembled townspeople, and she did not need to look at him to know what his face was doing. She looked at him anyway. He was wearing a clean black coat and his best hat, and he had shaved that morning, and his gray eyes were doing the thing they only did for her, warm and clear and unguarded. And when she came and stood beside him, he took her hand and held it with the gentle firmness of a man who is holding something he intends to keep. Reverend Polk married them in a ceremony that was plain and honest and took 20 minutes, and when it was done, the whole town seemed to breathe out at once, and Clara Morris wept with absolute no self-consciousness at all, and Sheriff Garrett shook Thatcher's hand with a grip that communicated several things at once, and Tommy Briggs, who had grown 4 inches over the winter and was now working for Grace full-time, stood at the back with his hands in his pockets and felt something he could only have described as rightness. Grace's supper that evening was the best she had ever cooked, laid out at the expanded Hales for the whole community, and it was a party that went on until well past the usual hour, with a fiddle player and dancing, and the kind of loud, generous happiness that a town creates when it has something genuinely worth celebrating. Annie Calloway arrived with her husband Thomas and their 2 children, Thomas Jr. and baby Clara, in late June, 1 week after the wedding, having made the journey from San Antonio by train with the determined logistics of a woman who is not deterred by distance. She was dark-haired and laughing, and she embraced her brother with a force that made him stagger slightly. And then she turned to Grace and took both her hands and looked at her with eyes the same pale gray as Ezekiel's and said, "You are exactly what his letters told me, and I am so glad you exist." Grace liked Annie immediately and completely, and the feeling was mutual, and the week of her visit was one of the fullest and happiest of Grace's life to that point. The small house at the ranch, suddenly full of noise and children and Annie's infectious laugh and Thomas Calloway's quiet decency. And in the evenings when the children were asleep, and the 4 of them sat together on the porch in the summer dark, she could see on Ezekiel's face the thing that the photograph on the mantelpiece had told her about. The particular quality of a man in the presence of his family, the part of him that had always been there beneath everything the world had made of him. "Come next summer," Grace said to Annie when they were saying goodbye at the station. "Try and stop me," Annie said, then more quietly leaning close. "He loves you in a way I honestly did not know he was capable of. Please keep being exactly who you are." "I don't know how to be anything else," Grace said. "I know," Annie said. "That's exactly the point." Summer settled into fall again, the second fall, and the rhythm of their life together took its shape. Grace ran the establishment and continued to expand it, adding that breakfast service, and hiring a second cook in the person of a woman named Rosa, who had come to Laramie from New Mexico territory with her husband, and had a talent for cooking that Grace recognized and valued immediately. Ezekiel ran his cattle and came into town regularly, and they lived between the two places, the ranch and the town building, without any fixed rule about which was home, and finding that this suited both of them, the movement between the two spaces, the ranch with its silence and sky, and the town with its noise and commerce and community. They had their arguments. These were real because they were real people, and the arguments had the texture of two people who are both strong-willed and honest, and who work through disagreement by the same method, which is to look at the thing directly and say the truth about it and keep talking until the thing is understood. Their arguments were never cruel. They were occasionally heated and sometimes long, and they always, eventually, arrived at the understanding they had been working toward, and the understanding was always better than the position either of them had started from. On one occasion, in the fall of 1880, there was a more serious disagreement about a man named Holloway, a new arrival in Laramie who had set up a competing eating house 2 streets over, and who had taken to undermining Grace's business through comments to customers and suppliers that ranged from inaccurate to outright false. Grace had been handling it herself, methodically and with increasing precision, addressing the false claims directly and letting her food speak for itself. Thatcher had found out about Holloway's behavior and had gone to see him in the sort of direct way that was entirely his own, and that had resulted in Holloway becoming very polite very suddenly. Grace had been angry about this, not because the outcome was unwelcome. Holloway had been genuinely harmful and his new politeness was an improvement, but because she had been handling it herself and she had not asked for intervention. "You went around me," she said. "I dealt with a problem," he said. "My problem," she said. "My business, my fight, Ezekiel. Those were your exact words when Forsyth tried the title business. My property, my fight, and you would help me see the terrain." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I know I am. I saw someone making your life harder and I wanted to stop it. I understand that," she said. "I know that's where it comes from. But I need you to let me be capable, not just tell me I am, let me be." He looked at her, and the thing that moved in his face was not defensiveness but genuine hearing, the specific attention of a man who is processing something important. "You're right," he said again. "I overstepped." "Thank you," she said. "It won't happen again." "I know it won't," she said, and because she was not a woman who held past ledgers, she let it go completely and they went and had supper. He respected her more after that, which she had not thought was possible given that he already respected her considerably. But there is a particular kind of respect that only comes from being corrected by someone you love and acknowledging it, and receiving the correction without diminishment, and that kind of respect he gave her freely, and she received without embarrassment, because they had that between them, the clean, honest ledger of two people who have chosen each other without illusion. In the spring of 1881, Grace told him she was expecting their first child, and she told him in her kitchen while she was making bread, hands still floury, because she was not a ceremony kind of woman even for the large things. She told him directly and watched his face, which went through 6 different things in the space of 4 seconds, and landed on something that she could only describe as radiant. He was across the kitchen in 2 steps, and he held her face in his hands with extraordinary gentleness, and he said, "Are you all right?" Which was the first thing he said, because it was the most important thing. And she said yes, and she was not frightened, and she was very happy. And he kissed her forehead and then both her cheeks and then her mouth, and she left flour on his coat, which neither of them remarked on. He was very attentive during the pregnancy, which expressed itself in his characteristic way, not with excess sentimentality but with constant practical attention, the ensuring of her comfort and the management of the heavy work and the watching of her with those gray eyes that missed nothing, and the way he would sometimes, sitting beside her in the evenings, put his hand flat against her growing belly with a wondering stillness that made her throat tighten with love for him. Their son was born in November of 1881, delivered by Dr. Ellen Marsh, who had come to Laramie that year and was the first woman doctor in the territory and whom Grace admired thoroughly. The birth was hard and long, and Grace was strong through it in the way that she was strong through everything, without performance, just endurance, and the breath-by-breath forward movement of getting through a difficult thing. When it was done and the boy was in her arms, she looked at him, this new small face, dark hair like hers and the suggestion of gray in the newborn eyes, and then looked up at Ezekiel, who was standing beside the bed, with a look on his face that she had never seen before on any human being's face, a look of such complete undone wonder that she would remember it for the rest of her life. "He looks like you," she said. Ezekiel reached out one careful finger and touched his son's cheek. "He's perfect," he said, and his voice was rough with something that he made no effort to conceal. They named him James Thomas Thatcher, the James for Grace's father and the Thomas for Annie's husband, who was one of the few men Ezekiel had been prepared to extend genuine trust. And when Annie received the letter, she wrote back that she had cried for 20 minutes, and that Thomas had been very moved, and that they were coming to see the baby as soon as the weather permitted travel. James was a serious baby, watchful and quiet in the way of both his parents. With his mother's directness in the steady gaze he turned on the world, and his father's stillness in the way he would simply observe a room from whoever was holding him. He was adored by Tommy Briggs, who had become something like an honorary older brother, and by Nell Duffy, and by Clara Morris, who arrived at Hale's every few days with some small knitted item and the proprietary warmth of a woman who had watched these two people find each other and felt herself connected to the outcome. Ezekiel with his son was one of the quietly transformative things Grace watched over those first months. He held the boy with the careful precision of a man who is aware of his own size and the smallness of what he holds, and he talked to James in the low, quiet voice that Grace had always found so particular and arresting, simple observations about what they were looking at. The sky, the horses, the way the light moved, offered to the baby with complete seriousness, as though the child deserved the truth told honestly regardless of his age. "He is going to be exactly like you," Grace said one morning, watching them from the kitchen doorway. Ezekiel looked up from where he was sitting with the baby on the porch. "God willing," he said, which was the closest thing to an expression of pure self-acceptance that she had ever heard from him. And it was one of the things she loved most about the ongoing project of him, the gradual and hard-won reclamation of a self that had been reduced by years of exile, and that was being rebuilt, piece by piece, in the warmth of being known and loved. The spring of 1882 brought Annie and her family for their second visit, and this time they stayed a full month, long enough for the children to know each other, long enough for Grace and Annie to develop the deep, comfortable friendship that had been building through letters for 2 years, long enough for Ezekiel to have his sister back in the proper ongoing way rather than the ceremonial once-a-year occasion he had been allowing himself. It was Annie, sitting on the porch of the ranch house one evening while the children were inside, and the men were in the barn doing some maintenance that was partially an excuse to let the women talk, who said to Grace, "Do you know what you've done?" "Run a restaurant and had a baby," Grace said. "You brought him back," Annie said simply. "I didn't think anyone could. I'm not sure he thought anyone could. He had made up his mind that this was how he was, this reduced version, and it was going to be that way until he was old, and then it would stop. And then he met you, and he wrote me letters that made me cry because my brother, who wrote to me once a month for years with 3 sentences of factual information, was writing me 2-page letters about a woman who told him to watch for the hot edge of a plate." Grace looked down at her coffee cup and smiled. "I didn't bring him back," she said. "He chose to come back. I just didn't make it frightening too. That's the whole thing," Annie said. "That's the entire thing." The summer of 1882 was the best summer yet, by Grace's reckoning. A full and various season of good business and the baby growing into a toddler with opinions, and the ranch doing well under the steady hand of two more experienced ranch hands whom Thatcher had brought on, and the small pleasures of their life which Grace catalogued in the private ledger of her gratitude: the morning coffee, the Sunday rides, the evening's reading by the fire, the way James laughed when his father made a face. The river stones lined up on her kitchen windowsill, 6 of them now, because she had kept adding one for each thing she wanted to remember. In the autumn, the second child arrived. This was not entirely unplanned. They had talked about it, the way they talked about everything, directly and practically, and with full honesty about what they both wanted and could manage. And what they had arrived at was that they both wanted more children and they were in a position to provide for them, and the timing felt right. Grace had said all this with the same forthright clarity with which she had once told Ezekiel she was in love with him, and he had said, with that quiet gravity that she would never stop finding enormously touching, "That's what I want too." The second child, born in October of 1882, was a girl, and they named her Margaret Annie Thatcher, the Margaret for Margaret Garrett, who had become a genuine friend, and the Annie for the obvious reason. And Annie Calloway cried again for the second time in the story of these children, and wrote a letter of such warmth that it needed to be read twice to fully receive. Margaret was entirely unlike her brother. Where James was watchful and still, Margaret was expressive and loud, and had strong preferences about everything from the age of approximately 5 months, which she communicated with impressive volume. She looked like Ezekiel, the same gray eyes and the same jaw, which on her was merely determined rather than intimidating, and from the earliest age she had that same quality of presence, the sense of a person who occupies their space fully and without apology. Grace watched her daughter with amusement and recognition. "She takes after you," she told Ezekiel. "She takes after you," he said. "She's already got opinions about everything. That's your jaw and your eyes and your stubborn streak." "The stubborn streak is definitely yours," he said, and she threw a dish towel at him, and he caught it without looking, which she found infuriating and funny in equal measure. By 1883, Hales had become the established center of Laramie's social and culinary life, a place that had grown from 4 tables and a chalkboard menu to a proper establishment with 12 tables, a full kitchen staff of 3 including Rosa, and a reputation that extended to travelers coming through on the Union Pacific who had heard about the place from other travelers and sought it out deliberately. Grace managed it with the same brisk intelligence she had managed everything from the beginning, making decisions quickly and well, knowing her suppliers and her customers and her staff, knowing the food deeply from the years of cooking it herself. She had also, over the 4 years since she arrived in Laramie, become something of a community institution in her own right, not in any formal way but in the way of a person who is present and reliable and useful, who turns up when things are hard and contributes without making it a performance. She had helped organize the relief effort when the winter of 1882 had been brutal enough to leave several families in genuine difficulty, working with Margaret Garrett and Clara Morris to coordinate food and firewood supplies. She had been the first person Nell Duffy had come to when she needed help navigating a difficult situation with her employer before Grace, a situation that Grace had handled swiftly and with teeth. She had employed Tommy Briggs when others might not have, had seen something in him worth developing, and Tommy Briggs at 19 was now capable and confident and grateful in the specific way that young people are grateful when someone saw them and helped them become who they could be. Ezekiel watched all of this with the quiet pride that had become one of his characteristic expressions around his wife, and he contributed to the community in his own ways, which were less visible but no less real. He had, over the years since their marriage, gradually and without announcement, extended a kind of protection to certain people in Laramie who needed it, not in any violent or coercive way, but through the presence and reputation that had once been a burden and had become, in the context of a life he was proud of, something more useful. When a new group of settlers came through in the spring of 1883, including several families who were Cherokee, making their way to land in the territory after years of displacement that had taken them from their original lands in the southeast, and who were met in Laramie with a hostility that was familiar and ugly, and that reminded Ezekiel of every injustice he had witnessed in the territories. He put his name and his property and his standing firmly behind their right to resupply and rest in peace, and Sheriff Garrett backed him, and the hostility backed down, and Grace opened hails to the families without any question or ceremony and fed them. It was the right thing, and they both knew it, and they talked about it that night after the children were asleep, about the particular responsibility of people who had standing to use it in the service of those who didn't. And Grace said something that Ezekiel kept with him the way she kept her river stones, which was, "The land belongs to everyone who works it honestly." That was always true. The law hasn't always agreed, but that doesn't make it less true. He wrote that, eventually, in a letter to Annie, and Annie wrote back that she was printing it on paper and putting it on her wall. The autumn of 1883 settled over Laramie with a golden fullness that felt to Grace, though she would not have said so aloud because she was not a dramatic woman, like a completion of something. She was 28 years old. She had a business and a home and a husband and 2 children, and a community she was genuinely part of, and a friendship with her sister-in-law that was one of the great pleasures of her life. She had the river stones on her kitchen windowsill, 8 of them now, and she knew what each one was for. One October evening, she and Ezekiel were sitting on the porch of the ranch house, the children asleep inside, the night air cold and clean and starred beyond any sky she had ever seen before Wyoming, and she had the particular contentment that only comes from a life that is full of things you chose and would choose again. "Ezekiel," she said, "yes. Are you happy?" He looked at the sky and then at her, and his expression was the one that was entirely hers. "Yes," he said. "Are you?" She leaned against his arm. "I am," she said. "I just wanted you to know that specifically, not generally, specifically." He put his arm around her. "I know," he said. "I'm glad." They sat there in the October cold looking at the Wyoming stars while the children slept inside and the horses were quiet in the barn, and somewhere down the road toward Laramie, the lights of the town were visible in the dark, small and warm and steady. A year later, in the fall of 1884, Grace discovered she was carrying a 3rd child, which she announced over breakfast with the same matter-of-fact directness that she announced most things, and Ezekiel's face did the radiant thing again. And James, who was nearly 3 and had opinions about everything, said that he wanted a brother, while Margaret, not quite 2, banged her spoon on the table in a way that probably meant something but was open to interpretation. Tommy Briggs, who was by now 20 and had saved enough money working for Grace to begin plans for a small venture of his own, a livery and supply business, celebrated the news with such enthusiasm that Grace had to tell him to bring it down several notches, or he was going to knock something off a shelf. Clara Morris knitted for 6 weeks straight. The 3rd child, born in the spring of 1885, was a boy, which satisfied James enormously. They named him William Ezekiel Thatcher, the William for no particular ancestor, but because it was a good solid name that Grace liked, and the Ezekiel because she had always loved the name, and because the man it carried deserved to have it carried forward. When Ezekiel first held his younger son, he looked at the boy for a long time and then looked at Grace, and she could see the full weight of what that middle name meant to him, and she met it calmly because she had given it intentionally and without need for elaboration. Annie came that summer with her whole family again, and Thomas Calloway, who was a quiet man of great steadiness, had a long conversation with Ezekiel on the porch one evening that went on past midnight, and that Annie and Grace, sitting inside with tea and the sleeping baby, and the particular comfortable intimacy of women who know each other well, were aware of as the low undercurrent of two men talking honestly about things that matter. The kind of conversation that men of that generation and that place rarely had, and that both of them needed. What was said in that conversation was between them. What came out of it, gradually, over the months that followed, was a further settling in Ezekiel, a quality of rootedness that had been growing since Grace, that had been growing since James, and that by the time William arrived was something close to complete. He was, at 37, a man who had found the life that fit him after years of wearing the wrong one, and the fit was so exact that it was sometimes almost startling to him, the way the right thing can be when you have been doing without it for too long. He wrote more frequently to Annie after Thomas's visit. He started spending deliberately more time in Laramie, in the community, at the town meetings and the social occasions he had always found a reason to avoid. He was not suddenly gregarious. He was never going to be the man in the center of every room. But the edge that had made people step sideways was different now, not gone, because it was part of him and the world was sometimes what it was, but no longer the thing that defined him. What defined him now was Grace, and the children and the ranch and the community, and the honest work of building a life that was bigger than what he had thought he was allowed to have. Sheriff Garrett, who retired in 1885 and was succeeded by his deputy, shook Thatcher's hand at his retirement dinner at Hale's and said, with the economy of a man who has said everything that needed to be said over years of unspoken mutual understanding, "You turned out all right, Thatcher," which was the highest compliment available in the territory, and both men knew it. By the summer of 1886, Laramie had grown considerably, the railroad traffic bringing more commerce and more people, and Hale's had grown with it, now occupying the full original building and the adjacent space that Grace had purchased 2 years prior, with a staff of 5 and a reputation that required no advertisement. Tommy Briggs's livery was established and thriving, and he had recently married a young woman named Eliza from one of the farming families in the surrounding territory, and Grace attended the wedding with the pride of a person who has watched something come from very little and grow into something full and real. James Thatcher, at 5, was attending the schoolhouse and was, according to his teacher, exceptionally attentive and unusually calm for a child his age, with a talent for arithmetic that suggested his mother's practical precision. Margaret, at 4, was attending the same schoolhouse and was, according to the same teacher, extremely lively and extremely bright and extremely willing to tell everyone exactly what she thought at all times, which the teacher said with the expression of someone who found this both admirable and exhausting in roughly equal measure. William, at 1, had just learned to walk and was approaching this new capability with an enthusiasm that required both parents to be paying attention at all times, because he had no concept of the edge of things and absolute confidence in his own stability that was not yet entirely warranted. It was in watching William discover that the porch had an edge to it, one ordinary autumn evening at the ranch, that Grace had a thought that she turned over for several days before she said anything. She said it on a Thursday evening when the children were in bed, and they were sitting by the fire in the ranch house with the wind outside, and the lamp lit, and his book on the table and her accounts in her lap. "I think we should move out here permanently," she said. He looked up from his book. "I can manage Hale's from here. Nell is capable of running it day to day. I would come in 3 days a week, but I want the children to grow up on the land, not in the town. I want space for them and I want space for us, and I think this is where we live." He looked at her for a moment. "This has been your choice from the beginning," he said. "It always will be." "I know," she said, "but I want to know what you think." "I think I've always thought of this as home," he said. "I want it to be yours too." "It already is," she said. They moved permanently to the ranch in the spring of 1887, and Grace kept the town building for Hale's, which Nell ran with the competence and the investment of a person who had been given real responsibility and was worthy of it. And Grace came in 3 days a week and kept her hand in the operation, and kept it excellent. And the arrangement was better than either of them had quite dared to imagine. The ranch house, which had been plain and functional and a little spare when Grace first came to it, expanded over those years with the accumulation of a family's life. Books on every available shelf. A large kitchen table where the family ate and where Grace kept her accounts, and where the children did their lessons, and where Ezekiel sat in the evenings. The photograph of Annie on the mantelpiece, now accompanied by a second photograph, taken in Cheyenne by a traveling photographer in 1883, of Grace and Ezekiel and James. James with the same grave, watchful expression he had in everything, Grace looking at the camera with her characteristic directness, and Ezekiel looking at Grace, which was not what the photographer had intended but was better than what he had intended. The river stones. She had moved them from the town windowsill to the ranch kitchen windowsill, and by 1887 there were 12 of them, each one particular, each one a kept thing. Their life together had a texture and a richness that Grace had not been able to fully imagine from the outside of it, back in Missouri, back on the train, back in the early months of building Hales and looking out her window at the main street of a rough western town and wondering what was possible. It was better than possible. It was actual. It was the specific daily reality of two people who had built something real and who knew what they had because both of them had known what it was to be without it. They still argued sometimes, with the same directness and the same eventual resolution. He still had the quality that made people cautious around him, the stillness and the presence that did not diminish with years of domestic life, but that was now housed in something larger and more visible, the context of the man he had become, the husband and father and rancher and community member, so that the caution people felt was accompanied now by respect of a different kind, the kind that includes knowing who a man is and what he values. Grace still ran her establishment with the same brisk precision that had defined her from the beginning, and she was better at it every year, and she knew it, which was not vanity but accurate self-assessment. In the autumn of 1888, they rode together into Laramie for the harvest celebration, which had become an annual event of some significance in the community. The main street decorated, and the fiddle players out, and the whole town in a mood of festive satisfaction. Grace drove the wagon with William on the seat beside her, while Ezekiel rode alongside, and James and Margaret were in the wagon bed squabbling about something with the low-stakes intensity of siblings who are fundamentally fond of each other, but would not currently admit it. She looked at the town as they came in on the road from the east. This town she had arrived in 9 years ago on a train from Missouri with a trunk and a deed, and no certainty about anything, and she felt the particular warmth of a person looking at something they have been part of making. Not created alone, you never made a place alone, but contributed to, genuinely and in ways that could be seen. The building on the main street that bore her name and the community tables inside it, and the meals that had been served there, and the people she had fed and the friendships she had built and the home she had made. She looked over at Ezekiel riding alongside, hat pulled low against the autumn sun, and he turned his head and looked at her as if he had felt her looking, which he probably had, because he had always had that quality of awareness around her, and he gave her the look that was entirely hers. She reached over and touched his arm just briefly, and he covered her hand with his for a moment. James, from the wagon bed, said with the withering clarity of a 7-year-old who has observed adults, "You're doing the thing again." "What thing?" Grace asked. "The looking at each other thing," James said. "You do it all the time." Margaret, abandoning her side of whatever they had been squabbling about, giggled. Grace looked at Ezekiel and he looked at her, and the look they exchanged over their son's head was the look of two people who are thoroughly caught and entirely unrepentant about it. And then they rode on into the harvest celebration of Laramie, Wyoming territory, in the autumn of 1888 together. That winter, with the snow coming down outside and the fire going in the ranch house hearth and the children asleep in their rooms and the lamp lit on the kitchen table, Grace sat with Ezekiel in the warmth of their home and thought. In the plain, clear way she thought about everything, about what she had. It was, she had decided long ago, more than she had known to want. The best things always were. She had a husband who was difficult and decent and deeply hers. She had 3 children who were alive and healthy and growing into themselves with the particular confidence of children who are loved without condition. She had a business that she had built from her own hands and her own vision. She had a place in a community, a real place, made by years of presence and contribution. She had a sister-in-law who was one of the true friends of her life. She had the land, the enormous Wyoming sky, the winters that were brutal and the springs that came back anyway. She had 12 river stones on her windowsill, and she knew exactly what each one was for. She looked at Ezekiel across the table where he was reading and she thought, there was a time when the most feared man in Laramie sat alone in the dusty Crown Saloon, and nobody brought him supper because nobody dared. And I walked in with a plate of beans and cornbread and told him to watch for the hot edge, and here we are. What are you thinking? He asked, without looking up from his book. How glad I am, she said. He looked up. Me too, he said. He put his book down and reached across the table, and she gave him her hand, and they sat together in the firelight while the Wyoming winter pressed at the windows and held no terror for either of them, because they were warm and they were home and they were each other's. Entirely and at last, and for as long as there was a country west of the Missouri, and a sky big enough to hold everything they had made. Outside the window the snow came down in the darkness, covering the land in white silence. Inside the lamp burned steady, the children slept, the river stones kept their place on the sill, everything was as it should be.